They stood waiting for death and were handed hamburgers instead. It was a clear April morning in Colorado, the kind of cold that sits in the bones. 16 boys, gaunt and small in ill-fitting American uniforms, lined up on a gravel yard at Camp Carson on April 22, 1945. Their faces were pale with hunger and fear. They had been told, or believed, that capture might mean the worst. In their minds, the end had a shape, a squad, a judge, a verdict. For many of them, the war had already stolen childhood. For some, the last thing they remembered before the uniforms was a parade ground, a shouted order, the smell of churned mud in a ruined town, and the promise that they were soldiers, not children. Among them was Eric Schneider, 14 years old, who felt the world narrowing to a single certainty: he would not leave that yard alive. Then the crates arrived. The sound was small at first, a clatter of wooden slats against metal, a murmur of voices. Men in American uniforms rolled up heavy boxes and unfolded the rough legs of a field kitchen. They lit fires, unrolled aluminum pans, and set a metal grate over coals. The boys watched in a silence so deep it seemed to hold its breath. Hunger made sensation sharper. Every small noise was amplified, every scent a promise or a threat. Food appeared in a way that felt like a different language. Sacks of soft white buns, stacks of ground meat patties wrapped in butcher's paper, crates of bottled Coca-Cola with glass caps that gleamed in the sun. The cooks worked with an efficient choreography, shaking salt into the pan, flipping meat as it sizzled and browned. The air filled with sounds that had nothing to do with guns: the ping of a metal spatula, the hiss of fat hitting hot coals, the soft tearing of paper. Heat rose in a gentle wave. Smells came next: the warm, savory scent of cooking meat, the yeasty sweetness of toasted bread, the sharp, almost electric fizz when a bottle was opened and condensation slipped down glass. For the boys, used to the thin, bitter broth of scarcity and the hollow ache of hunger, it was uncanny. Eric remembered years later the way the first patty cradled in a bun seemed to glow in the hands of an American soldier he did not know. He remembered the heat and the softness, the unfamiliar weight of a full stomach beginning to press against his ribs. The first sip of Coke shocked something that had not been used much: pleasure. Cold and sweet and utterly innocent, it slid down like a small, bright memory being formed. There was no fanfare. The soldiers did not march the boys to parade ground or read them a speech. They simply offered the food. Plates were handed out, and the boys, many still expecting some formal end, received them as if a miracle had been arranged by the ordinary machinery of the army: a man in a cook's apron holding out a sandwich, another holding a bottle, offering it without comment. The gap between the boys' terror and the practical, almost casual generosity of the cooks was so great it made the day feel unreal. Something shifted in slow motions. Shoulders eased. Hands stopped trembling so much they could lift the food to mouths. Eric's breath, which had been shallow and quick, lengthened as he ate. He tasted the salt and fat and bread, and felt his brain accept that for this moment there would be no execution. He was still frightened, but a sliver of disbelief cut between the fear and the fact. The enemy, or what their training had called the enemy, had offered kindness. If you like stories like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, and share any family WW2 stories in the comments. The scene in Colorado did not happen in a vacuum. By 1945, the United States had become, in material terms, a global granary. American food production, immense and industrial, stood in sharp relief against a Europe that had been ground down by years of blockade, bombing, and agricultural collapse. The U.S. wartime economy could move millions of tons of grain, meat, and canned goods across oceans. At the same moment, German civilians and the youngest remnants of its military structure were facing hunger on a daily basis. Arrested transportation and deliberate requisitions had left whole towns with barely enough to survive. Across the United States, there were more than 500 POW camps, and over 425,000 German prisoners were held on American soil. These numbers have an abstract power when read on a page, but they acquire a human weight when you imagine the faces behind them. Men and boys far from home, sometimes dressed in the wrong size boot, often with a story that began long before they ever saw a POW camp, a village, a schoolyard, a sudden call to arms. Among these prisoners were teenagers pressed into roles by a regime that blurred the line between youth and soldier. The American system of housing prisoners was large and, in many places, orderly. The men and boys who found themselves far from the front lines and from the ruins of their cities encountered in some camps a steady supply of good food. That abundance functioned as more than caloric input. It was a language in its own right. A warm meal told a tale of industrial capacity, of supply lines stretching back across the ocean, of a nation whose resources allowed it to feed and clothe. For youths like Eric, the meal became evidence, tactile proof that another order existed, one in which hunger need not be constant, and in which the people across the ocean were not only enemies in the uniforms they wore. This was soft power, subtle and persuasive. It did not instantly erase the grievances of a continent or undo political programs that had shattered lives, but for a teenager standing in a gravel yard with the fear of execution in his gut, the act of being fed created a local revolution. Where ideology taught hatred and suspicion, an unexpected sandwich introduced nuance. A single sensory experience can bend a belief in ways words rarely can. The taste of warm meat, the relief of a full stomach, the simple ritual of sharing. These are not mere comforts, they are inputs into the mind that recalibrate what is possible. Back in the yard, the change was not theatrical. No one rose and pledged allegiance to the cook. The boys did not suddenly forget everything that had brought them there, but something subtle and accumulating began to operate. The boys' eyes, previously trained to read aggression in every movement, found room to look for human gestures. Laughter, a quiet, stunned laugh, bubbled up in places. One of the younger boys, who had barely spoken since his capture, began to describe, in a few halting words, a town back home where his mother had once baked bread. Voices creaked open the way doors do after a long winter. For the first time in a long time, the boys' futures seemed to contain an image of ordinary life instead of only danger and deprivation. For Eric, the memory of that first meal created an anchor. In the decades that followed, long after the uniforms had been exchanged for civilian clothes, and after the scars of war had dulled into the texture of ordinary life, he could still call up the smell of that cooked meat and the feel of the soft bun between his fingers. When he raised his grandchildren, he would sometimes tell them, not as a boast, but as a quiet fact, that a sandwich once made him question what it meant to be an enemy. He did not speak often about the orders that had led him to the front, nor did he romanticize the past. What he described instead, again and again, was the astonishment of being offered something so simple as a meal when he believed the only possible outcome was death. Memory is not a light switch. It is less dramatic and more cunning than that. A single event does not erase the past, but can alter the way past events are organized in the mind.
Psychologists who study memory and trauma have observed that sensory anchors, smells, tastes, tactile sensations are often the most persistent. They carry with them not only recollection, but an emotional valence that can change over time. For Eric, the hamburger became a kind of key. It unlocked a sense that kindness could exist across lines of war. That knowledge did not erase guilt or grief, but it created a new pathway. In place of an absolute hatred, a hesitation. In place of immutable identity, a room to breathe. The larger historical consequences of such moments should be drawn carefully. One meal given to 16 frightened boys did not remap geopolitics. It did not single-handedly turn enemies into friends overnight.
Yet when multiplied across thousands of small interactions, cooks offering food, guards responding with restraint, soldiers treating prisoners as human beings rather than statistics, these moments helped create the conditions in which reconciliation became possible. Ordinary acts of compassion soften the edges of conflict. They do not substitute for formal political reconciliation, for treaties or for justice, but they influence how individuals conceive of the other side, and individuals shape societies. Camp life resumed its rhythms. The men who cooked meals and the guards who patrolled the perimeter returned to their duties. Word, as it does, traveled. Stories of the unexpected meal spread from camp to camp, sometimes altered by retelling, but often clinging to the most human details: the hiss of the grill, the gleam of a bottle cap, the softness of bread that was scarce back home. In the microcosm of those camps, behaviors reconfigured not by orders but by habit. The boys who had eaten that day became, in small ways, less automatic in their suspicion. They started to accept simple kindnesses without reading them as traps. When the war ended, Eric, along with many others, was repatriated. Re-entry into civilian life is not a single moment, but a long process of rearranging identity. For teenage soldiers, it involved finding schooling or work, negotiating relationships with family who had endured separation and loss, and deciding what to do with memories that were sharp and sometimes shameful. In the immediate post-war years, food shortages in Germany persisted in many areas. Rebuilding infrastructure and supply chains would take time, and the presence of Allied forces introduced another layer of complexity for those returning home. Eric settled back into Dusseldorf, a city that had been both familiar and alien after the war. He married, worked, and raised children. Yet the recollection of that April morning in Colorado remained present, a small, persistent thread in the weave of his life. Years later, standing in a market, the smell of grilled meat would transport him back to the yard at Camp Carson more effectively than any photograph or story. The sensory memory carried the emotional truth more convincingly than narrative could. There had been a moment when an enemy had chosen to feed him. That choice, simple and perhaps pragmatic for the men who cooked, took on a meaning that would shape Eric's inner fate. There is a temptation in telling this story to inflate the significance of a single act. It is tempting to present a neat arc: hunger, mercy, redemption. The truth is more modest and more powerful for being so. The meal at Camp Carson did not promise Eric a long and easy life. It did not erase the years of fear, the weight of loss, and the moral complexities of being a young person swept into an ideology and then into combat. What it did was open a crack in a hardened perception. It introduced ambiguity where there had been certainty.
It gave Eric a reason, years later, to think of some Americans as humans capable of kindness. That cognitive shift is not trivial. If a generation of young men and boys adopts a less absolutist view of an enemy, the ripples of that change are unpredictable but real. Across the broader landscape of post-war Europe, many small acts of decency performed by ordinary people contributed to the long, uneven work of reconciliation. Soldiers who treated prisoners with dignity, neighbors who shared food with strangers, and individuals who refused to return hatred for hatred. These were not the stuff of headline treaties, but they softened communal relations in 100 unrecorded ways. Food often functioned as the medium of these gestures, simply because it is one of the easiest and most direct ways to show care. To hand someone a meal is to acknowledge their humanity in a way that words can sometimes fail to accomplish. It is important to be precise about what we claim here. Saying that Americans changed the fate of German child soldiers with hamburgers is not to assert a deterministic, single-cause miracle. Instead, it is to argue that the act of offering food in moments of terror shifted perceptions and therefore altered inner trajectories. The boys who received kindness in the form of a hot sandwich left the yard with a new piece of information. Some people across an ideological divide could act without malice. For a human mind already grappling with doubt and rumor, that information matters. It can change the small decisions that aggregate into a life: whom to trust, how to name the enemy, whether to nurse or to heal old wounds. Those subtle choices are part of the complex shape of what historians sometimes call fate. We can also read this scene as a lens on the moral choices available even in war. Wars, by their nature, produce violence and cruelty, but they also present opportunities to act otherwise, to refuse the degradation of another person, even if such refusal is costly. The cooks at Camp Carson could have done their duty in a narrow sense and served rations only to the soldiers. Instead, they fed prisoners. Whether their motivation was compassion, a sense of military propriety, or the practical necessity of maintaining calm among prisoners does not wholly change the effect. The boys ate, their bodies were nourished, their assumptions began to bend. There are risks in sentimentalizing such moments. Acts of kindness can coexist with brutality. Humans are capable of both. And we must acknowledge that many victims of the war suffered in ways that no sandwich could touch. Hunger does not account for all trauma. Memory does not erase loss. Yet to ignore the moral power of small gestures is to miss how human relations are repaired over time. Large policies and courts adjudicate blame and craft legal remedies.
But the slow, complicated work of living beside former enemies demands countless personal interactions that create new patterns of trust. In the final years of his life, Eric would sometimes visit a street market. There, a grill might emit a scent that made his head turn, his eyes cloud. He would close his mouth as if taking in a memory, and for a moment the Colorado sun would be near. People passing by would have no sense of the history entwined with the smell. To them, it was merely the smell of food. To Eric, it was an emblem of survival and surprise. In quiet conversations with friends and family, he would speak about being young, about the hunger, about the unexpected kindness that taught him there were exceptions to the rules he had been taught to obey. This is not a story that celebrates one nation or denigrates another. It is not an argument that food alone won hearts and minds. Rather, it is an invitation to see how human choices, even the apparently trivial ones, can plant seeds. They do not always sprout, and when they sprout, they do not always bloom into something grand. Oftentimes, the growth they produce is subtle, a diminished suspicion here, a willingness to sit with a former foe at a table there. Over time, these small changes accumulate into a social atmosphere less likely to yield to the simplest narratives of perpetual enmity. There is a lesson here for remembering history as a practice. The archival record is rich in strategy, statistics, and decision-making at the highest levels. But lived history, the daily experiences of people caught in great events, is often made of tactile sensations, the heat of a pan, the weight of a bun, the fizz of a soda. These sensations anchor memories and, through memory, influence choices. Preserving such stories matters because they remind us that the past is not only policy and bloodshed, it is also the texture of small mercies. So when we say that Americans changed the fate of German child soldiers with hamburgers, we mean that in a precise, humane way. The offering of food in a moment of extreme vulnerability shifted how some young prisoners perceived those who had captured them. That shift did not guarantee salvation, but it did alter how those boys composed their inner lives thereafter. A taste, a smell, a moment of being treated with unexpected decency rewired a young mind enough to make different decisions later. Those differences, multiplied across lives and time, helped to widen the thin space in which reconciliation could take root. History is often taught as a succession of great events, but if we allow ourselves to look closer, we begin to see the cumulative power of small acts. The cooks and guards at Camp Carson did not rewrite the map, but they performed an act whose echoes reached far beyond a gravel lot in Colorado. They fed human beings. They introduced an alternative to the narrative of inevitable villainy.
For boys like Eric, that single meal became a touchstone, a quiet counterargument to the story that enemies must always remain enemies. If this story moved you, like and share it so these quiet moments of history are not forgotten. Subscribe for more human stories from the past and help keep these memories alive.